Welcome back to the program. We're joined tonight by Labor MP Stephen Jones, former Liberal MP Ross Cameron, former Labor advisor and co-founder of One Big Switch, Lachlan Harris, and the Shadow Minister for Employment Participation, Sussan Ley. Let's turn to the issue of the carbon tax. Soon to be the emissions trading scheme if Kevin Rudd gets his way. It is a bit of an if. It would be gone altogether if Tony Abbott wins the election and introduces direct action. The shift 1 year earlier costs nearly $4 billion, and not everyone's a winner when it comes to this. Lachie, what do you think about the way this was done, this announcement?
Yeah, look, I thought it was a no-brainer for it. I think, as said on the day of the night he got elected, one of his big first moves will be to move, because it's kind of, you got the great politics where basically you're dealing with a cost of living problem, but you can technically moving to a cleaner solution. But for me, climate change is a character issue for Rudd. That's why I understand the politics of climate change. I think have changed quite a lot. I think anyone will tell you that from 2007 till now, clearly. But when Rudd talks about doing an ETS, that's a character issue. I think people understand that's him saying, I've learned from my mistakes. It was a horrendous mistake to dump the CPRS, and I'm going to be more firmer and tougher this time on sticking to my kind of principle when I make that decision. So for me, the politics of it are all one way for Rudd. It was like an absolute lay-down misere. It's good on the cost of living stuff. There's a bit of populist in there. It also goes to the character issue of dealing with
He was given this opening, wasn't he, because Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan didn't do it. Wayne Swan said last night they thought about it in the May budget, that things were volatile in Europe, they were worried about linking into but because they didn't, gave Kevin Rudd this opening.
If Gillard had done it, it would have had a very different, it would have created a very different reaction, because it was her decision at such a painful political cost to go to the carbon tax. It would have looked, I think it would have gone down very badly, actually. And that's just, you know, because of the history of the two Prime Ministers. For Rudd, it's a lay-down misere, and I actually think he should go harder on climate change. Not because I think anyone really wants to see.
In which way?
I think he should talk harder about the ETS and be more, serious
about the environmental benefits, or about the,
exactly right. And I think because when Rudd talks about the CPRS or the ETS, whatever they're calling it now, I think that's his way of communicating to the electorate that he's learned from his mistake, and his biggest mistake was dumping the CPRS, and he's a stronger Prime Minister. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he probably puts his foot down on climate change a bit harder than would be explained by the role that climate change as a pure political issue is playing in the community.
Ross, do you agree on the politics of this, at least, that it was a no-brainer for Kevin Rudd to do this?
Yeah, I think it was. I would agree. I wouldn't disagree with anything Lachie has said there. I will say that what we are seeing is this pattern where when you get a Labor Prime Minister in this particular government, you get two leaders of the opposition, because each Labor Prime Minister is opposing the policies that were constructed by the one before. And so...
Not that Julia Gillard's about to speak up and rail against this.
So, Julie, on carbon, mate, I think that's a pox on both our houses.
So you go from... Julia Gillard's problem was she could not run on Kevin Rudd's record, and now Kevin Rudd can't run on Julia Gillard's record, so they both wind up getting elected and spending the first half of their term dismantling all the policies they're
But it is also awkward.
Abbott has run on everyone's record.
It's a little bit awkward for some in the Liberal Party too, and without naming names, there are some who have argued pretty strongly for exactly this sort of scheme. Yeah,
look, I mean, if you are, a believer that man is, rapidly warming the earth, and you need some sort of mechanism to change it, there is a certain rationality to such a mechanism. I mean, the problem that you have in terms of the actual consequence of the decision is that you wind up making a whole range of industries which are done more cleanly in Australia than just about anywhere in the world. You just wind up exporting all that work into countries and jurisdictions that have no respect for emission standards and quality of fuel and the way in...
Depending on the carbon price, if it's high, yes, you might have that disincentive, but if it's pretty low, they're not going to pack up their workforce and shift to China if the penalty isn't that much. I wouldn't have thought. But
the problem is, Dave,
Susan, there are plenty of your colleagues who have backed an emissions trading scheme just like this in the past.
Look, I am certainly not a climate change sceptic, and the Coalition has a policy about climate change and accepts that man-made climate change is a reality. And for those who have their doubts, and I accept that there are many in the community that do, we know that a reduction in fossil fuels is good for the planet, and it's something that we should go ahead with, which is why our scheme makes a lot more sense than linking the Australian carbon price to a European price. And the Prime Minister saying, but relax everybody, it's only low and it won't hurt you. But by the way, if it happens to go up in Europe, and the corruption of the trading scheme in Europe is well known, and that's why the price has dropped. But if it happened to jump up to $40, where it's expected to go,
is it corruption?
Then we will.
Corruption is a strong word. I thought it was a bit of a failure of the market.
It's flawed, and nobody can say anything positive about it, even those who were the architects of it. So if we're linking ourselves to the European price, then we're losing control of what happens here. And it's an excuse that Kevin Rudd is making by saying everybody doesn't need to worry because it's only $6 a tonne, because that's, again, trying to hoodwink the Australian people. And it's still a tax. I mean, if anything, it is a tax. It raises revenue. You buy a permit to emit carbon and you pay money, and that's a tax.
The price might move around, but that fundamental point is right. It's still a floating tax, isn't it?
Look, the fundamental point is this. If we are going to change the way we use energy in this country, and if we are going to move to a less carbon-intensive economy, we've got to do that by the most efficient way possible, the most effective way possible, and everybody who knows anything about this says you put in place a market mechanism. Put in place a market mechanism and you link it to the rest of the world.
But it hasn't been a spectacular success in Europe, has it?
Well, yeah, they've got a floating price in Europe, and some would argue that it has been successful in Europe. I would argue that as the market deepens and as more countries around the world and more jurisdictions around the world are entering and linking their jurisdictions to the European market, then we are going to see a mature pricing of carbon in this country. But let's not get away from what the objective is. Let's not get away from the objective. If your objective is to reduce carbon emissions, your policy is Mickey Mouse. Your policy won't work. You'd have to plant more trees than would cover the surface area of Tasmania to meet our objectives, to meet our joint objectives, the 5% by 2020. So we know it won't work. It's the sort of policy that you adopt when you don't believe in anything.
Stephen Jones, getting back to your policy, though, yes, the price will fall in 2014 from July next year. But then, based on Treasury's own figures, it goes up and up and up after that. $12, $18.60, then $25.10, and presumably more after that. So it's a temporary reprieve before going back up to a similar price level.
Yeah, the issue is that we want Australian businesses and Australian households to pay no more or less than anywhere else around the world. We want them to have access to the cheapest cost of abatement.
Well,
the cheapest cost of abatement is going to be made available to them if they have access to international carbon permits.
You don't care about Australian manufacturers.
Oh, that is absolute rubbish.
Well, you don't.
That is absolute rubbish.
Because their competition has no carbon tax.
You could make exactly the same. That's exactly the same argument against tariff walls. We all believe we want a low carbon economy. You either get there by a market or you get there by the government picking winners. And the market's better at that than the government. And that's why you have a market mechanism. But there's no great advantage to the government sitting in Canberra and going, oh, well, let's pay for it this way. It's revenue. You have to take carbon out of the economy. Either the market decides how to do it or bureaucrats in Canberra decide how to do it.
Under your policy, you are paying our largest polluters subsidies to somehow reduce their carbon emissions.
There's a purity in, I accept Ross's debate. If you don't believe in climate change, then the ETS is madness.
Yes.
That's absolute truth, because it is, of course, expensive to reduce.
Ross, do you think an ETS is preferable to direct action?
Well,
be honest.
I'm not sort of thrilled either way. I think, I know that we have built, did we create a whole brand new building for the Department of Climate Change in Canberra? I know it's going to be this sort of massive new Pentagon-style bureaucracy, but then maybe we just abolish the Department of Climate Change, if I remember correctly.
But would you rather have the market decide where emissions should be lowered, or bureaucrats?
Yeah, look, I'm pretty agnostic about it, pretty happy either way. I think if you do an intelligent direct action program where you can actually concentrate energy on fixing, basically there's about 4 really dirty power stations in Australia that contribute about 25% of the filth.
right? Now, if you want to take 25% out, fix those 4 power stations. Okay, that's called direct action. I think I'm sceptical. I think Kevin Rudd is massively attracted to anything that involves a multilateral treaty and a lot of conferences. And I think Tony Abbott is a bit more inclined to say, okay, what is the damn problem here? Let's fix it. Okay, now I respect problem solving. And I like action.
David, I've got a newsprint mill in my electorate that was put on the list of dirty emitters by this government and would like to introduce a cogeneration plant which is far more effective in terms of using the byproduct heat from electricity to drive a steam turbine to make it more efficient. So once they got the red mark by this government, they then realised that their entire industry was under threat. Newsprint will be imported from Asia and our newspapers will be printed on Asian newsprint. Our direct action plan notionally could provide the funding to move to cogeneration to make them more competitive in the face of this government's policy. So you can talk about the politics and the theory all you like, but we in the real world deal with real manufacturing
who
businesses.
Where are you getting the money from? Yeah, but who decides where to... Okay, but who decides where to...
We have an allocation for the money, and I mean, you know that there's an allocation there.
We can tell you where the money is coming from, because what we are doing, a sensible policy says, well, you put a price on the heavy polluters and you use that money to subsidise plans which are going to reduce emissions, and that's what the Clean Technology Plan's all about. We don't have to wait for your government to be elected. In fact, you should be telling the manufacturer in your electorate to make an application to the scheme that's already running.
And if it's the local MP's job to decide which businesses survive and which don't,
that's the point, isn't it? Who should decide whether your newsprint factory or your cat food factory
direct action
gets the
rather
taxpayers' money?
Decided it.
Well, this is a market which, you know, one of the reasons why I'm agnostic is we do have some experience of watching these markets in operation, and basically most of the world's major financial institutions created climate divisions who were getting into the business of buying and selling and trading permits. And everyone who went into it went broke. And I don't find a whole lot of people going broke. It doesn't fill me with confidence.
So do you want to start on
the carbon price will come down, but all of the household assistance stays. So to pay for this, there are a few things being done, but the biggest one is getting rid of automatic fringe benefits tax deductions for salary packaged cars. Stephen Jones, are you completely comfortable with the change that's been made here and the impact this is already having on workers?
Absolutely sensible policy. If you're going to claim a tax deduction, and that's what we're talking about, you are claiming a tax deduction, then you should at least have to prove that you're eligible for it. And that's exactly what we're asking people to do. We're asking people, if you are claiming a tax deduction, if you're provided with a vehicle and you see that vehicle is a work vehicle, then we're asking you to prove that.
So no apology
of that
to the 80 staff will be laid off tomorrow at one firm.
Yeah, look. No, that's with the greatest respect. That is,
but that's the real impact of what's being done here.
Look, of course, whenever a worker loses their job, any worker loses a job, then that is a tragedy. But does that mean that every time a government makes a decision that impacts a worker, then we should not make that decision? Because whenever we do something to remove what is effectively a rort or a distortion of the rules, we shouldn't do that if there is a worker.
That's not why you're doing it. You're doing it to find some money. You're not doing it to remove.
Are you seriously defending a situation, Susan? Are you seriously defending a situation that somebody should get a tax deduction that they're not entitled to?
What is the Liberal position on this?
Well, I actually was involved in writing the tax ruling on novated leases when I was in the tax office. I'm not trying to spruik my tax credentials here,
So you're to blame for this.
But I've kept in touch with quite a few people, and several of them have called me and said, you know, we're out of business overnight. And OK, the government can change the goalposts, but it's quick, find some money. We've got to scramble to fix a hole in the budget. Who can we jump on? I mean, there's no integrity in this.
So what is
and
the
this government's
position
obsessed with paperwork. So, of course, everybody has to provide more paperwork. The only method that will work is a logbook method, which is more paperwork. So businesses have to be loaded up with more compliance.
You know that's not true, don't you? You know that there are mobile phone apps. You know there's a mobile phone app already on the market that can do this for you. You press one button when you get in.
Look, I don't think the people who've let their staff go are doing it lightly. If there wasn't going to be any pain, then they would have kept their workers on.
Just get the app. Just tell those 80 people who just got sacked, bang, bang, bang. Just get the...
I'm just going to put to you the proposition. Are you seriously arguing that people should be able to claim a tax deduction that they're not entitled to.
Look,
is that your policy?
What I will say,
because
David,
that is the sense of what you're. Somebody should be able to claim a tax deduction that they're not entitled to. And what the announcement that the Treasurer's made is, if you are claiming a tax deduction, then the very least we are asking you to do, 3 months over 5 years, is prove you're entitled to it.
Okay,
I think ordinary Australians would say, you know what, fair
The Treasurer
enough.
hasn't consulted with any of the businesses involved because the decision was made presumably in less than 48 hours. So it's a classic Labor government in action, is that you grab the wealth, you redistribute it, you cut off one section of the community, but you don't even talk to people first. Why not even just talk to some of the people involved? There might have been a way to work through this. If this is what you really need to do to grab your 1.4 billion or whatever it is you think you're going to save from this measure, then at least consult with the real families with real skin in the game, with their houses mortgaged for their small businesses. I mean, it's a disgrace.
So what will the Liberals do?
Are you really claiming that people should be entitled to a tax deduction?
Well, I think we just made a pretty
only
decent
argument
point.
is not.
I think that Sussan is making a very good point, that this feels very much like the knee-jerk reaction of an unthought through. It feels very much to me like the Joe Ludwig's response to the live cattle, and it hasn't been thought through, and it just creates this scythe that just goes through and decimates an industry, and then the next day they sort of think, oh geez, we should have thought about that. And this is why we need adults running the government. Okay, we need to actually pick up the phone and say, look, this is what we're contemplating. It's not 1.4, it's 1.8 billion. And I think Kevin Rudd has turned around to Chris Bowen and said, look, we've made this quick move on carbon. We need to find another 1.8. Where are you going to find it? And some Treasury official has said, well, maybe we can hit those. You know, and now Labor is saying these people are rich.
Stephen Jones, it may be a loophole, but it is going to hurt the car industry as well, isn't it?
Well, not as much as the removing of the $500 million worth of car industry assistance.
Nice deflection, but it is going to hurt the car industry.
I find it a little bit tough to have members of the coalition out there crying crocodile tears over the impact on the car industry, where their policy will close it down overnight.
The impact.
I don't believe it will. I don't think it's going to have the drastic impact. Look, there may be some adjustments. There may be some adjustments, but I don't think we're going to see, you know, the massive devastation that some of the overbaked, overreached responses from, you know, helium balloon Joe Hockey that we've seen in the last 12 hours. Absolutely ridiculous.
80 people got sacked immediately. It was like just a whole line of them. Immediate response, just line them up, bang, 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 bang.
Does this policy
See you
every
later.
policy? You're pulling $2 billion out of somewhere and you're putting it somewhere else. Someone's going to be affected. That's inevitable. The question for Labor is it worth it to go from a carbon tax to an ETS? I'd argue yes, it is. Does that mean some people haven't been dislocated? Of course. Every single change in the budget will shut a business down, basically. Like there is, show me a change that doesn't. In the tax laws, it'll have very large and significant influence. It's $2 billion. There's no low-hanging fruit. The question, the test for Rudd is, can he make the case that it was worth it to dump the carbon tax and move to an ETS? I think he'll be able to make that case pretty easily.
All right, we're going to take another break, then come back and look at, how Tony Abbott is adjusting to the new political climate. Stay with us.